My name is Emily Thorne, and tonight I was paying for my own execution, or so it seemed. The private event room at the Harmony Grove Clubhouse was a masterpiece of curated perfection, the kind of place that made you forget you were still technically in a suburban HOA hellscape. Frosted glass walls blurred the outside world into soft watercolor strokes of identical two-story houses and surgically manicured lawns, while inside a constellation of candles danced across crystal glasses and polished mahogany. Each flicker felt like a tiny silent explosion against the enforced beige everything. I am by trade and by nature a woman who deals in absolutes, the cold, hard logic of systems and controls. As senior compliance auditor for Ridgebank, my job is to spot patterns, flag anomalies, and cut the rot before it spreads. It's a skill that translates disturbingly well to HOA life. And for the last 6 months I had been running a full-spectrum audit on my own neighborhood. The $8,000 deposit for this gala, the 5th anniversary celebration of President Victoria Langford, had been charged to my personal account. I was the architect of this gilded trap. At the head of the long table, holding court like she owned the subdivision, which, in her mind, she did, sat Vicky Langford, 52, poured into a liquid satin dress the color of spilled Cabernet, hair helmeted into submission by 3 cans of extra hold spray. She was the embodiment of HOA Karen perfection, smiling for the cameras, quoting community standards like scripture, but underneath it all a woman who had turned our once peaceful cul-de-sac into her personal fiefdom. To everyone in this room, board members, select homeowners, a few sycophantic neighbors, she was a titan, the guardian of Harmony Grove's sacred 2.75-inch grass rule and the sworn enemy of unapproved bird feeders. To me, she was a line item in an investigation, a liability I was about to write off. Seated to her right, so close their chairs were practically kissing, was Marcus Hale, 48, our esteemed vice president and the man she had been working late with for the past year. He hung on her every word, laughter a little too loud, hand finding her forearm a little too often. He looked at her with undisguised adoration. I saw a co-conspirator. The rest of the table was a blur of faces, homeowners whose lives were dictated by Vicky's endless citations. They were here to celebrate her 5 glorious years of power. They were unknowingly here to serve as witnesses. The first course, delicate seared scallops on saffron risotto, was cleared. The second, filet mignon that cut like butter, disappeared. Conversation hummed with corporate-style backpatting and inside HOA jokes that excluded me by design. I sat at the opposite end, silent smiling benefactor, the ghost at the feast. I played my part, nodding politely, raising my glass when required, while my mind ran through the final checklist. Server briefed, manager on standby, projector calibrated, evidence compiled. Everything was in place. Then came the moment. Vicky tapped her sterling silver knife against her crystal flute. The clear, high-pitched ring sliced through the chatter. A hush fell. Her smile widened into that practiced camera-ready expression of magnanimity. She stood, satin dress catching the candlelight like fresh blood. "Thank you, everyone," she began, voice smooth as the rules she loved to weaponize. 5 years of protecting our beautiful community standards. It's been an incredible journey, and that's down to the hard work of every single person in this room. Her eyes swept the table expansively, then settled with intimate warmth on Marcus. But there's one person I have to thank above all others. Someone who has been in the trenches with me, my rock, my partner in every late-night board meeting. She paused for effect. A few people glanced my way with fleeting sympathetic smiles. They thought this was coming to me, the woman who had just dropped $8,000 to make this night possible. How adorably naive. "So the biggest thank you tonight," Vicky continued, gaze locked on Marcus, back fully turned to me, "goes to Marcus Hale, my HOA vice president. The one person who truly gets it, The one who has been with me working through every challenge. Every single night. A wave of knowing laughter laced with discomfort rippled around the table. Marcus blushed, hand over his heart like a modest hero. It was a perfectly executed performance of HOA intimacy, just plausible enough to deny, but loaded with meaning as clear as the ridiculous no pink flamingos sign Vicky had forced on Mrs. Alvarez last month. She had just toasted her secret lover on my dime, in front of the entire board and half the neighborhood. She hadn't just ignored me, she had erased me. In that moment, under the warm, forgiving glow of the candles, a profound calm washed over me. The quiet professional hum of my watch vibrating against my wrist was the only signal I needed. One discreet buzz from the clubhouse manager. The system was live. The trap was sprung. I leaned forward slightly, my own smile serene. I caught Vicky's eye for a fraction of a second as she sat down, flushed with her own importance. "Lovely toast, Victoria," I said, voice just loud enough to carry. She gave a dismissive, triumphant smirk. She thought she'd won. She thought this was her night. My fingers, steady and precise, found the bottom of my phone resting in my lap. A single fluid swipe. Tapped. The ambient lights in the room began to dim, sinking from warm golden glow to soft expectant twilight. A collective murmur went through the guests. They probably assumed it was me, the generous sponsor, about to play a surprise video montage of Vicky's greatest hits. Ribbon cuttings, citation ceremonies, that time she made old Mr. Jenkins rip out his perfectly healthy rose bushes. The frosted glass wall at the far end shimmered, then resolved. It was no longer a wall. It was a screen. And on that screen in stark, unforgiving high definition was the first image. It wasn't a photo of a smiling HOA family. It wasn't a clip from the annual block party. It was a clubhouse invoice, specifically an invoice from the Harmony Grove Events Fund for a 2-night strategic planning retreat at the Grand Ridge Resort. The dates matched a weekend Vicky had claimed was board business. The name on the reservation was hers and Marcus's. At the very bottom, under method of payment, were the clear, indisputable words, Harmony Grove HOA MasterCard. Absolute silence descended. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every breath. The only noise was the sharp, sudden clatter of a fork falling from someone's nerveless fingers. It sounded like a gunshot. 20 pairs of eyes glued to the screen, then flickered to Vicky, whose face had drained of all color, leaving behind a waxy, horrified pallor. Her triumphant smile collapsed into slack-jawed disbelief. Then slowly, horribly, every eye turned to me. I hadn't moved. I just sat there holding my water glass, watching the foundations of her little empire begin to crack. The show was just beginning. The silence in the room was a living entity, thick and suffocating. Vicky's face, frozen in the cold blue light of the projector, was a mask of crumbling arrogance. Marcus looked as if he'd been struck, his navy blazer suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. I let the image of the resort invoice hang in the air a few more seconds, allowing the full weight of it to settle on our audience. I had their complete, undivided attention. My stage was set. It was time for the narrator to take over. "It began 6 months ago," I said, my voice calm and even, cutting through the stillness like a scalpel. I didn't need to raise it. The quiet was so absolute my words landed with the force of a gavel. I was reviewing the quarterly HOA expenditures, a routine part of my oversight duties as the only resident who actually reads the financial packets you all ignore. I looked directly at Vicky, whose eyes were wide with dawning panicked horror. She was beginning to understand this was not a simple emotional outburst. This was a neighborhood takedown. There was an anomaly, I continued, a 17% spike in community relations and board wellness spending. To a multi-million-dollar HOA like ours, is practically a rounding error. But to someone who deals in compliance for a living, an anomaly is a thread, And you always pull the thread. So I pulled. The initial expense reports were a masterpiece of mundane deception, meticulously crafted by Vicky to appear normal. Dinners, client gifts, transportation. But the details, when cross-referenced, began to fray. There were invoices for floral arrangements, expensive bouquets of black calla lilies and orchids, not sent to the clubhouse, but to a luxury condo downtown. The recipient was listed simply as M. Hale. A quick search of public property records confirmed the obvious. A further check of the HOA security camera logs showed Vicky's Mercedes leaving the neighborhood at 10 p.m. on those exact nights, returning at 3 a.m. Funny thing about HOA servers, I said to the captivated audience, my gaze flicking over to Marcus, who was now staring at his untouched plate as if it held the secrets to the universe. People think when you delete an email, it's gone forever. It isn't. The cloud archives everything. Our e-discovery protocols can retrieve conversations from years ago. It's a legal necessity. The slide changed. It now showed a series of bored emails, timestamps and all, retrieved from the secure HOA server. Vicky, meeting at my place tonight. Marcus, bring the strategic plans. Marcus, can't. Emily's been asking questions about the landscaping bids. Vicky, fine. Usual spot. I'll book it on the HOA card. Call it vendor appreciation for evergreen landscaping. Marcus, you're terrible. See you there. Evergreen landscaping was a particularly nice touch. A real vendor they had been pushing through without competitive bids. It added a thin veneer of plausibility. But Vicky's real genius was in how she spread the rot. It was financial death by 1,000 paper cuts. A spa day for 2, including a couple's massage, was buried under board wellness initiative. An order of extravagantly priced wine delivered to Marcus's condo was coded as gifts for prospective vendors. The resort weekend from 3 weeks ago was just the latest and most blatant in a long, carefully curated string of thefts. She had been funding her affair with everyone's monthly dues, laundering her infidelity through the very systems I had quietly been monitoring. Once I identified the pattern, my voice remained steady, a lecturer explaining a complex theorem. I placed a quiet flag on every expenditure Vicky approved, especially those co-signed by Mr. Hale. Any transaction was automatically duplicated and routed to a secure personal audit file I created. I had then made a formal, albeit discreet, request to the state HOA Oversight Board. They began a passive surveillance protocol, nothing invasive, just tracking the use of the MasterCard, vehicle logs, and after-hours access badge swipes. The data compiled was comprehensive, but the affair, as sordid and insulting as it was only the surface-level corruption. The real betrayal, the one that threatened more than just neighborhood harmony, was buried deeper. It was in the vendor contracts and landscaping bids. Corporate theft is one thing. Security-style fraud in an HOA is another. The slide changed again, this time to a financial ledger that made several people at the table gasp. It showed a series of payments from our key landscaping supplier, Evergreen, to a shell LLC called Ridge Consulting Partners. Vicky was receiving consulting fees from Evergreen, tens of thousands a month. In exchange, she ensured their contracts with Harmony Grove were renewed without competitive bidding and at massively inflated prices. She was taking kickbacks. The owner of Ridge Consulting Partners, as a simple tax registration search revealed, was Marcus's brother. A sloppy, arrogant mistake. She thought no one would ever look. She forgot who she was dealing with. I had all of this information 2 months ago. Every piece of irrefutable, career-ending evidence. I could have confronted her then in the privacy of a board meeting. I could have filed a formal complaint and walked away quietly with my dignity and my bank account intact. But that would have been insufficient. A quiet departure would have allowed her to spin the narrative, to paint me as the bitter resident who couldn't follow simple rules. She would have played the victim. The damage to the HOA would have been contained, perhaps even covered up to avoid a scandal. No, that wasn't justice. That was merely damage control. I realized, I confessed to the silent room, that confronting her privately would be a mistake. A quiet implosion wouldn't suffice. The crime was audacious, public in its own way, hidden in plain sight within the HOA books. The consequences, therefore, had to be public as well. I needed a stage where her arrogance would be on full display, a stage where she would feel invincible, surrounded by her loyal subjects, a stage where the humiliation would be swift, total, and witnessed by the very people whose respect she craved. What better stage than a monument to her own ego, the 5th anniversary gala, a gift from the supportive resident she had spent years slandering and fining into submission. She had been so delighted when I offered to cover the deposit. She saw it as her due, a fitting tribute to her reign. She never once questioned the cost or my motives. She just assumed it was another perk of being Victoria Langford, Queen of Harmony Grove. She didn't realize the gift was a Trojan horse. She didn't see that the $8,000 price tag wasn't for her celebration, but for her downfall. The price of admission was her presidency. So I planned. I orchestrated every detail with the same precision I applied to a bank compliance audit. The guest list, the menu, the seating chart, and the technology, this beautiful frosted glass wall that could become a high-resolution screen with the tap of a button on my phone. This entire evening, I said, my eyes sweeping across the stunned faces, was designed for a single moment, the moment she would stand up, full of expensive champagne and self-regard, and expose her own character. I paid for the microphone, and she willingly delivered the confession. My black card, the one I used to secure this room, is a symbol of the life I built despite Vicky's best efforts to make me miserable. It's a tool that opens doors to places like this, that affords a lifestyle of quiet dignity while she tried to bleed me dry with fines. She saw it as her own, an extension of her status. She forgot that the name on the front is Emily Thorne. She forgot that the person who has the power to open doors also has the power to slam them shut. And tonight, with a single swipe, that card had opened the door to this room, and in doing so had just closed every other door that would ever matter to her. The polished lie of her reign was about to be stripped away, leaving only the ugly, documented truth. The projected image of the evergreen payment ledger held the room in its icy grip. But that was merely an overture. That was Vicky's professional suicide. I was here to execute her financial and reputational annihilation as well. An HOA presidency is a contract after all, and our governing documents were far from standard. While the guest stared, horrified at the evidence of her misuse of funds, my mind was on a different document. A far more elegant and lethal piece of paper currently resting in a fireproof safe at my attorney's office. 2 years ago, when I first moved in and realized what kind of president we had, I didn't see a community leader. I saw a liability. So I had my personal attorney draft a carefully worded addendum to the HOA bylaws that I quietly circulated among a small group of fed-up homeowners. Vicky had barely glanced at it, eager to get to the part where she retained total control. She dismissed it as a formality, a quirk of overly cautious residents. She never truly read the fine print. Buried deep within the meticulously structured legal language, between clauses on asset division and enforcement rights, was Section 11, subsection B. We called it the Morals and Reputational Clause. It was my invention, and my attorney had perfected its language until it was an ironclad work of art. The clause was simple in its premise and devastating in its application. It stated that if the president were to engage in behavior that resulted in the public humiliation of any member, or if the president were to commit acts of financial malfeasance that could bring disrepute upon the association, especially given my role in compliance, Then the offending party would forfeit any and all claims to board privileges, special assessments, and would trigger an immediate recall vote. The separation would be absolute. She would leave with nothing but the fines she had already collected. But the clause had a specific and very demanding activation protocol. It couldn't be triggered by rumors or private discoveries. The act had to be public and it had to be witnessed. Specifically, it required validation by no fewer than 2 credible impartial witnesses at what the document defined as a formal or significant association event. Vicky's 5th anniversary gala at the clubhouse certainly qualified. "You see," I said, my voice dropping into a more confidential, almost instructive tone. A betrayal of this magnitude required a response of equal measure. It required witnesses. At that, 2 people seated at a smaller adjacent table, a man and a woman who had appeared to be enjoying a quiet dinner of their own, placed their napkins on the table and turned their chairs to face our room. Vicky's eyes, darting around for any possible ally, any escape route, fell upon them. A flicker of confusion, then a sickening wave of recognition washed over her face. She knew them. Of course she knew them. They were Miriam Coulter and David Sterling, 2 of the most senior and influential members of the state HOA Oversight Board. "Victoria, you remember Miriam and David, don't you?" I asked sweetly. I invited them for a quiet dinner. They were so kind to accept, even under the pseudonyms I booked for them. Privacy is so important. After all, Miriam Coulter, a woman whose gaze could freeze molten steel, looked at Vicky not with anger but with profound, chilling disappointment. David Sterling, a man who had mentored many HOA presidents in his time, simply shook his head slowly. They were the perfect witnesses. Unimpeachable. Their testimony that they had witnessed President Victoria Langford publicly toast her lover on the association's dime, the president being the one who had spent years fining and slandering other members, was more than enough to satisfy the first condition of the clause. But I believe in redundancy. Seated at another table just within earshot was Eleanor Vance, our association's lead outside counsel for ethics violations. She had been coincidentally dining with her husband. Her eyes met mine across the room, and she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The legal machinery was already turning. The beauty of the clause was its efficiency. It didn't require me to produce photographs of them in bed. It didn't require a private investigator's report filled with sordid details. Proving an affair in the legal sense can be messy. Proving public humiliation is a matter of record. Her toast was the gunshot. Her words were the bullet. And I had made sure the entire event was recorded. When I booked this private room, I explained to the room at large, though my words were a direct blow to Vicky, I noted the clubhouse's policy. I gestured to a small, tastefully framed sign near the door, "Premises monitored for quality and security purposes." I simply asked the manager to ensure the audio log for this room was properly archived. "Your entire speech, Victoria, is now a time-stamped audio file." Her toast was the detonator, and I was the gunpowder carefully laid. I had watched her as she spoke those words, every single night, at that exact moment. From my vantage point at the end of the table, I saw Marcus's hand slip under the tablecloth. I saw his fingers gently, possessively squeeze her knee. It was a tiny, intimate gesture, but one filled with volumes of meaning, and it was not missed. The room's audiovisual system, which I had requested for my presentation, included a discreet wide-angle camera. It had captured the entire tableau, her back to me, her adoring gaze on him, his triumphant touch. The act of reputational harm was documented, witnessed, and recorded in both audio and video format. The clause didn't require physical proof of an affair. It only required a recorded act of profound disrespect and dishonor performed in public at a formal HOA event. It was a cleaner, sharper, more elegant weapon. She hadn't just cheated the association. She had, in front of her board and her residents, declared me irrelevant. She had used my resources to celebrate her disloyalty. That was the violation, and that was all the bylaws needed. With the eyes of the oversight board members, the legal counsel, and her entire loyal court fixed on her, I discreetly picked up my phone one last time. It wasn't to play another slide. It was to execute the final command. I opened a simple secure application linked directly to my attorney's case management system. There was a single button on the screen under a file titled Langford v. HOA Contract. I pressed the button. The screen confirmed the action in stark black and white text. Clause 11 be activated. Timestamp 2058. Event location Harmony Grove Clubhouse. Witnesses notified. M. Coulter. D. Sterling. E. Vance. File seal delivered. A digital signal shot from the clubhouse to a secure server, alerting my legal team that the conditions of the morals and reputational clause had been met and triggered. The process of financially and officially excising Victoria Langford from power had just begun. It was irrevocable. It was final. I had just saved the neighborhood thousands of dollars and a protracted, ugly recall battle, all before the main course had been fully digested. She just didn't know it yet. She was still reeling from the professional blow, completely unaware that her reign had just been liquidated. The personal and professional devastation was now legally in motion, a silent, efficient process running in the background. It was time to bring the professional execution to its very public conclusion. My expression remained impassive as I gave the screen a command with my phone. The image of the emails and resort bills vanished, replaced by a clean corporate-style flowchart that was in its own way far more obscene. It was a simple diagram of money laundering, 3 boxes connected by bold arrows, tracking a flow of capital that was both circular and parasitic. The first box was labeled Harmony Grove HOA. An arrow pointed from it to the second box, Evergreen Landscaping, representing the inflated payments for their services. From Evergreen, a second arrow pointed to the final box, a company no one in the room, save Vicky, had ever heard of, Ridge Consulting Partners. The final arrow showed funds moving from Ridge Consulting directly into an account that, while not explicitly labeled with Vicky's name, was the clear end point of the trail. For those of you who manage the budget packets you never read, I began, my voice taking on the quality of a forensic accountant presenting findings. You are familiar with our vendor Evergreen Landscaping. You may have noticed their invoices have increased by roughly 30% over the last 2 quarters despite no significant change in the scope of their services. Victoria, as president, personally approved these increases, citing enhanced community aesthetics and predictive maintenance capabilities. A lie. The slide expanded on the third box. Ridge Consulting Partners is a shell corporation registered just 8 months ago. It has no employees, no physical office, and provides no discernible service. It exists for one reason: to receive a portion of the inflated payments Harmony Grove makes to Evergreen. It is a kickback vehicle. Vicky, who had been pale before, now looked translucent, as if the blood had entirely deserted her. She opened her mouth to speak, to object, but no sound came out. She was a cornered animal, realizing the trap was far more complex than she could ever have imagined. Establishing the ownership of a shell LLC can be tricky, I continued conversationally. But people, especially arrogant people, often get lazy. They use familiar patterns. The registered address for Ridge Consulting was a simple post office box. However, the address listed on the IRS tax identification filing was a residential home 2 hours from here. The slide changed to a Google Maps image of a modest 2-story house. A home belonging to the parents of Marcus Hale's brother. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This wasn't a petty HOA spat playing out in public. This was a criminal conspiracy, methodically unspooled for all to see. The payment memos from Evergreen to Ridge Consulting are all coded with the same note. I said as the corresponding wire transfer detail appeared on screen. It reads, "Success fee, pilot closed." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I searched every project management database, every vendor record, every piece of internal communication in the HOA portal. There was no pilot with Evergreen. It never existed. It was a ghost project created to justify a phantom fee. The most damning piece of evidence came next. I let it fill the entire wall. A screenshot of an email that was breathtaking in its stupidity. It was from Vicky's official HOA account sent to Marcus's personal email address. The subject line was blank. The body was short and to the point. "Marcus, the next Evergreen payment is coming through. It's larger than usual. Move it under the Q4 Community Enhancement category in the LLC's books. Emily won't see it there. She never looks that deep into landscaping." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just shock. It was laced with fear and a dawning horrified respect. Every single person in that room, from the junior board member to Marcus Hale, slowly turned their heads from the screen to look at me. The woman who supposedly never looked that deep. I held their gazes for a moment, then gave a small, almost indifferent shrug. I saw two words. They landed with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The implication was clear. She thought I was a fool, a pushover resident too busy dodging her citations to ever notice the grime in her books. She had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman she had spent years tormenting. I didn't just look deep. I lived in the depths. I built the systems she thought she was so cleverly exploiting. To remove any doubt that this was anything but a formal proceeding. The next slide was a scan of a document bearing the official state HOA oversight letterhead. It was an internal investigation request form. At the top in a bold stamped font was the case ID 6F23. The subject was listed as potential violation of vendor management and executive expense policies v. Langford. And in the bottom corner the date and time of submission were clearly visible, digitally watermarked by the system. It had been filed 72 hours before this gala began. "This is not a personal vendetta," I said, addressing the wider audience of her loyal subjects. "This is the result of a formal association investigation initiated by me in my capacity as a dues-paying member with compliance expertise." The focus then shifted mercilessly to Marcus. The screen changed to a different kind of invoice. This one was from an upscale 24-hour spa. It detailed a 90-minute deep tissue massage and an aromatherapy session. The appointment time was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The date matched a board strategy session Vicky and Marcus had logged in the calendar, and the payment method was once again the Harmony Grove MasterCard. While Victoria was busy defrauding the association of hundreds of thousands of dollars, I stated, Mr. Hale was content with the smaller grift. Late-night spa treatments, designer gift baskets, salon appointments, all dutifully filed under vendor relations. A particularly bold expense was the team-building weekend for two at a vineyard, which curiously coincided with my own business trip out of town. Finally, I brought it all home to the cold hard reality of HOA governance. The final slide was a simple table, a screenshot from the Harmony Grove bylaws. It was the spending and approval authority matrix. It clearly stated that any executive-level expense over $5,000 required secondary approval from either a direct superior or a designated peer. Vicky's fraudulent expense reports, including the kickback-inflated vendor invoices, were all over that limit. And next to each one in the digital approval workflow was the name of the approver, Victoria Langford. She had violated the most basic of internal controls. She had approved her own expenditures, a fireable offense on its own, even without the underlying fraud. She had used the HOA as her personal bank account to fund her affair and her greed. I let the image of the violated policy hang there for a moment. I looked around the room at the pale, shocked faces of her board, at the stony expressions of the oversight members, at the trembling form of her lover. I had systematically dismantled her reputation, her presidency, and her finances using nothing but her own actions, her own data. I advanced to the final slide of my presentation. It was blank except for a single sentence written in a clean sans serif font in the center of the screen. Numbers are loyal. People aren't. I lowered my phone. The presentation was over. Marcus made a small choking sound. With a hand that trembled visibly, he reached for his wine glass but seemed to think better of it. He slowly, deliberately placed the glass back on the table, the small click of crystal on linen sounding like a crack of thunder in the silent room. His face was the color of chalk. The party was officially over. The air in the room was so thin it was a wonder anyone could still breathe. Vicky stared at the screen, her face a canvas of disbelief and dawning terror. Marcus looked like a ghost, his ambition and smugness completely extinguished, leaving only a hollow shell in a navy blazer. The guests, her loyal board, were frozen, their faces a mixture of fear for their own citations and a morbid fascination with the spectacular implosion of their leader. The spell was broken by the softest of sounds, the click of the private dining room door opening. It didn't swing open dramatically. It opened with a quiet, deliberate motion. And Miriam Coulter stepped inside. She wasn't angry. She was something far worse. She was resolute. She surveyed the scene, the terrified faces, the damning evidence still glowing on the wall, Vicky's shattered composure, and me sitting calmly at the far end of the table. David Sterling and Eleanor Vance followed her in, their expressions equally grim and professional. They didn't enter as dinner guests. They entered as a tribunal. Miriam's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. It was a look of grim acknowledgement. Then she turned her full attention to the head of the table where Vicky sat, a president deposed in her own court. "We've heard," she said, her voice not loud but carrying an immense weight that filled every corner of the room. "And we have seen enough." That was the signal. The dam of Vicky's composure finally burst. She shot to her feet, the legs of her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her face was a contorted mask of fury and betrayal, her eyes finally locking onto me with pure, undiluted hatred. "Emily, what the hell are you doing?" she roared, her voice cracking with desperation that was almost pathetic. "What is this?" I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked up at her, my expression one of mild inquiry, and answered the question she had asked. "I'm paying for dinner," I replied. The simplicity of the answer, so literal and yet so profoundly metaphorical, seemed to stun her into a momentary silence. Before she could formulate another response, Eleanor Vance, the outside counsel, stepped forward. She moved with an unnerving lack of emotion, a lawyer performing a routine function. In her hand was a crisp white envelope from her briefcase. She placed it on the tablecloth in front of Vicky's seat. It landed with a soft final thud. "Victoria Langford," she said, her voice a formal legal monotone. "This is a letter informing you of your immediate temporary suspension from your duties as president of the Harmony Grove Homeowners Association pending the results of a full internal and external audit. This is effective immediately." The word immediately hung in the air like poison. Vicky stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Marcus finally found his voice, a weak, trembling whisper. I was just doing my job, following orders." Miriam Coulter's gaze swiveled to him, and it was utterly withering. "Mr. Hale, we will ascertain the full scope of your job and the nature of those orders during the formal proceedings. Until then, I suggest you say nothing further." Marcus visibly shrank, silenced and dismissed in a single sentence. He was no longer a person. He was a subject of an investigation. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single key, the key to Vicky's HOA golf cart, the ultimate symbol of her power. I slid it across the polished mahogany table. It spun once before coming to a stop near her hand. "You'll be needing this," I said calmly. She looked at the key, then at me, uncomprehending. "For what?" "Your HOA MasterCard, your fuel card, and your access to the association fleet were just frozen," I explained as if discussing the weather. 10 minutes ago, to be precise. As if summoned by my words, a furious vibration started against the table. It was Vicky's phone. She glanced down at the screen and her face, already pale, turned the color of ash. A cascade of notifications was flooding her lock screen. An electronic onslaught erasing her from the association she thought she ran. HOA notification. Master account access suspended. IT security alert. Email account network access temporarily locked. Facilities management. Clubhouse executive access deactivated. She was being digitally excommunicated in real time. She was locked out. A president without a title, without an office, without a MasterCard. In the midst of this profound association and personal demolition, a figure appeared at my elbow. It was the clubhouse manager, his face a perfect mask of professional discretion, as if he hadn't just witnessed a presidency immolated. "Ms. Thorne," he murmured, voice low and respectful. "My apologies for the interruption. Would you like us to proceed with the dessert course?" The sheer surreal normalcy of the question was a stroke of genius. The entire room turned to me. What would I do? Would I call an end to this brutal spectacle? I turned to the manager and gave him a warm, genuine smile. "Yes, Antoine. Thank you. Please bring the cake." A few minutes later, 2 servers entered the silent room bearing a magnificent multi-layered chocolate cake glowing with the light of 52 candles. It was a work of art, a perfect centerpiece for a celebration. They placed it in the center of the table, and for a moment it looked like a grotesque parody of a president's party. Then everyone saw the inscription. Written in elegant looping letters of dark chocolate were 2 words. "Happy birthday, compliance." A collective silent gasp. It was the ultimate, most personal insult, a branding of her failure with the very name of my profession. I picked up the silver cake knife. In the dead quiet of the room, the sound of the blade slicing through the soft buttercream and moist cake was unnaturally loud. It sounded like a guillotine. Vicky finally slumped back into her chair. The fight completely gone out of her, replaced by a hollow, cavernous despair. She looked at me, her eyes pleading now, the hatred replaced by raw, naked fear. She lowered her voice to a hoarse whisper, a sound meant only for me. But in the silence, everyone heard it. "You're going to destroy me, Emily." I placed the first slice of cake onto a plate and looked at her. Not with hatred, not with triumph, but with the cold, dispassionate finality of a closed ledger. "You already destroyed yourself, Victoria," I said quietly. I just turned on the lights. The slice of cake sat on the plate before me, a perfect quadrant of chocolate and frosting. It was an island of order in the chaos of a rain coming undone. Vicky stared at the cake, then at the letter of suspension, then at the impassive faces of the oversight board members who had moments before been strangers at a nearby table. Her mind, usually so quick and calculating, was visibly struggling to process the sheer speed and totality of her ruin. She seemed to think this was the climax, the final act of my revenge. She was wrong. This was merely the clearing of the board before the checkmate. "This is insane," she finally managed, her voice a low rasp. She turned to Miriam Coulter, attempting to summon a shred of her former authority. "Miriam, you can't let her do this. This is a personal vendetta. It's a neighborhood dispute. It has no place here. The suspension is not valid without a full board hearing." Miriam looked at her with an expression of profound weariness. "Victoria, the bylaws of Harmony Grove and the state oversight guidelines are quite clear. The board has the authority to suspend any officer pending investigation. If presented with credible evidence of gross misconduct or potential criminal activity that poses a risk to the association. What we have seen here tonight, she gestured to the screen, which still displayed the damning email, is more than credible. It is definitive. This is not the end of the conversation, Vicky blustered, a desperate flailing attempt to regain control. There are procedures. There are homeowner interests to consider. She had foolishly handed me my cue. She's right, I said, my voice cutting in smoothly. The homeowners should have a say. I reached into the leather portfolio I had brought with me, which had been resting by my chair. From it, I withdrew a single folded document. It was printed on heavy bond paper, the kind reserved for contracts and legal deeds. I placed it on the table. This, Victoria, is a letter of proxy. It represents a collective 5% voting bloc of homeowners that has grown displeased with your leadership style and, more specifically, your expense accounts. The investors were a group of fed-up residents I had quietly organized over the last 2 months. People tired of the endless fines and ridiculous rules. Vicky stared at the paper. A 5% block was not insignificant, but it wasn't enough to overthrow her on its own. She looked confused. So what? You have a proxy vote. That doesn't give you the power to do any of this. Ordinarily, you would be correct, I conceded with a small academic tilt of my head. But this is not an ordinary proxy. My attorney and I drafted it very carefully last month. I unfolded the document, revealing a paragraph highlighted in yellow. It contains a supplementary clause, a springing condition, if you will. It stipulates that, in the event the sitting president becomes the subject of a formal internal investigation for financial malfeasance or ethical violations, this proxy's vote is automatically and irrevocably cast in favor of any board motion for a vote of no confidence and the immediate appointment of an interim replacement. I looked up and met her gaze. The formal investigation ID number 6F23 was opened 72 hours ago. The trigger condition has been met. As I spoke, David Sterling's phone resting on the table beside him emitted a soft chime. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and then looked at Miriam. The notification just came through from the corporate secretary's office, he said. The vote has been officially lodged. Miriam Coulter's gaze was like a physical weight on Vicky. With that 5%, Victoria, combined with the votes the oversight board already controls, we now have a clear majority. We have the authority and we have the cause. We are appointing an interim president effective tonight. The finality in her voice seemed to snap something deep inside Vicky. The fear and shock were consumed by a wave of pure impotent rage. She surged to her feet again, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. You have no right, she bellowed, her voice raw and shaking. She pointed a trembling finger at me. This is my association, my life. You have no right to. I cut her off, not by raising my voice, but by lowering it. My words were quiet, precise, and utterly unshakable. I don't force things, Victoria, I said, looking directly into her furious eyes. I prepare. In that moment, a small desperate movement broke the tableau. Marcus, who had been watching the entire exchange as if he were a spectator at his own execution, reached out a hand. It was an instinctive gesture of support, a final futile attempt to align himself with the woman he had hitched his future to. His fingers brushed her sleeve. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Vicky recoiled as if his touch were a hot iron. Don't, she snarled, yanking her arm away. The motion was so abrupt that it knocked over her full glass of red wine. It shattered on the floor, splashing a dark blood-red stain across the pristine white tablecloth and the hem of Marcus's trousers. It was a perfect, brutal metaphor. She had soiled him, and now she was casting him aside in her panic. Marcus froze, his hand hovering in the empty air where she had been, his face crumpled. The last vestiges of hope and defiance drained away, replaced by the stark, ugly realization that he was utterly and completely alone. She would not protect him. She would, in fact, feed him to the wolves to save herself. I watched this small human tragedy play out without a flicker of emotion. Then, with deliberate slowness, I reached back into my portfolio and retrieved a second item, a slim plain white envelope. I slid it across the table until it came to a stop directly in front of Marcus Hale. He stared at it, then at me, his eyes wide with fear. "That," I said quietly, "is a separation agreement. It is generous. It offers 2 months severance, a release from any legal action by the association for your part in the expense fraud, and a fully paid consultation with a top-tier career counseling firm. In return, it requires your immediate resignation and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." I paused, letting the terms sink in. "It is the only offer you will receive. It expires tonight." He didn't move. His gaze drifted from the envelope to the wine-stained tablecloth, to the damning evidence still displayed on the screen, and finally to the face of Victoria Langford. She refused to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the oversight board members, still pleading his own case in his head. In his world, Marcus no longer existed. He was just collateral damage. That was all the confirmation he needed. His choice was clear. Go down with a sinking ship captained by a woman who despised him, or step into the lifeboat I had just provided. With a trembling hand, he reached for the envelope, but I stopped him. "No need for a pen," I said. I slid my personal tablet across the table, the screen already glowing. The document was there, ready for a signature. "It's all preloaded in DocuSign. Just sign with your finger. It's faster, cleaner." He looked at the screen, his breath catching in a small ragged sob. He then looked at me, a flicker of something, hatred, gratitude, understanding, in his tear-filled eyes. He took the tablet. His finger trembled as he scrolled his name in the designated box. He pressed accept. A moment later, a quiet electronic ping echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of a DocuSign notification confirming a legally binding signature had been recorded. A single digital click that severed the final tie, closed another door, and left Victoria Langford standing in the ruins of her reign, utterly and finally alone. With Marcus's digital signature hanging in the air like a final silent verdict, the strategic part of the evening was complete. The HOA takedown was executed. The bylaw's kill switch was flipped and the co-conspirator had been cleanly excised. All that remained was the settling of accounts. The personal bill. Right on cue, as if he had been waiting in the wings for this very moment, Antoine the manager glided back into the room. He moved with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to navigating the emotional minefields of the ultra-wealthy. In his hand he held a black leather bill folder. He approached me, not Vicky, and presented it with a slight deferential bow. "Ms. Thorne," he said softly, "the final account for your evening." I opened the folder. The total at the bottom was, as expected, eye-watering. The initial $8,000 for the room, the custom menu, and the initial champagne toast was there, but below it was a meticulously itemized list of additional consumption. I scanned the list. 3 bottles of Chateau Petrus, a ludicrously expensive Bordeaux that Vicky had ordered with a great flourish to impress her board, a round of 25-year-old Macallan single malt scotch, various other extravagances she had added throughout the evening, believing, as she always did, that someone else's money was hers to burn. Vicky watched me, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Perhaps she thought this was a final test, that I would quietly pay the full amount to avoid a scene. She was, as ever, a poor student of my character. I looked up from the bill, my gaze sweeping over the table before landing on her. My voice was clear and precise, carrying the same weight as my earlier presentation. My gift, I stated, for all to hear, was a community gala. It was intended to celebrate the association. I let that hang for a beat. That gift ended at the precise moment you stood up and chose to use this platform for public humiliation. The contract of my generosity was breached by your toast. I turned to Antoine, who was listening with professional impassivity.
Antoine,
We will need to split this bill. A low murmur went through the room. Splitting a check at an event like this was a profound social faux pas. It was a public declaration of a rupture. The initial charge for the room and the preset menu which I arranged and guaranteed with my deposit will be charged to my card which you have on file, I instructed. Everything else. I tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the itemized list of rare wines and spirits, everything ordered at this table by Ms. Langford during the course of the evening is her personal expense. Please prepare a separate bill for her. Antoine nodded once, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Of course, madam. He took the folder and retreated. Vicky looked stunned. This was a level of petty precise detail she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about the money. It was about the public removal of her power, her status as the celebrated host. She was being demoted to just another resident, one who now had to pay her own way. A few minutes later, Antoine returned with a small portable point-of-sale machine and 2 separate bills. He presented the first to me, which I signed without looking at the total. He then walked the length of the table and placed the second, much smaller but still substantial bill in front of Vicky. She stared at it. Her face, already a mess of conflicting emotions, settled on a look of defiant pride. She would pay. She would show me she didn't need my money. She reached into her purse and pulled out the black Harmony Grove HOA Master American Express card, the ultimate symbol of her presidential status. She thrust it at Antoine. Here. Antoine took the card and inserted it into the machine. The room was silent. Everyone watched. The machine processed for a moment. Then a small insistent beeping sound began and a tiny red light started to blink. Declined. The blinking light was like a siren, a public announcement of her powerlessness. Her master account, as I had told her, was frozen. She was nothing.
Antoine,
To his credit, was the soul of discretion. I'm sorry, madam. The card appears not to be working. Do you have another? A dark mottled flush crept up Vicky's neck. The humiliation was exquisite. She snatched the MasterCard back and fumbled in her purse again, her movements clumsy and agitated. She pulled out her personal Visa, a card with a far more modest credit limit. She knew, and I knew, that it wouldn't be enough to cover the cost of a single bottle of the Petrus she had so grandly ordered, let alone 3. She hesitated, the card hovering over the table. To have her personal card declined after her master one failed would be an absolute unrecoverable social death. As her hand trembled, I reached into my portfolio one last time and pulled out the third and final envelope of the evening. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a contract. It was a spreadsheet. I pushed it gently across the table toward her. Perhaps this will help with your liquidity problem, I said. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the columns. It was a complete detailed accounting of every fraudulent expense, every kickback from Evergreen, every spa day, every bouquet of flowers for Marcus. At the bottom right corner in a bold red font was the grand total. It was a sum that would take her a decade to repay on her own. Attached to the spreadsheet was a simple one-page document. It was a repayment proposal and a confession of misappropriation of association funds. Miriam Coulter, who had been watching this entire exchange with the cold patience of a predator, chose this moment to speak. The State Oversight Board considers the funds detailed in that document to be an association debt. Ms. Langford, she stated, her voice like ice. Repayment is not optional. That money does not fall under the category of an executive benefit. Vicky looked from the spreadsheet to the restaurant bill she couldn't pay to the unblinking eyes of the oversight board members. She was trapped. Signing my document was her only way out of the immediate public shame of being unable to pay for her own celebratory wine. With a shuddering breath that was almost a sob, she took the pen I offered her. Her hand shook so violently that her signature on the bottom line was a barely legible scrawl. She signed a confession and a promise to repay hundreds of thousands of dollars, all to avoid the shame of a few thousand on a clubhouse bill. She pushed the signed paper back toward me. I leaned forward, my voice a whisper that only she could hear. "You won't sleep well tonight, Victoria," I said. "I will." Just then, a server approached the table, a stack of takeaway boxes in his hands. He addressed me. "Madam, shall we box up the rest of the cake for you to take home?" I looked at the beautiful cake with its ironic perfect lettering. I gave the server a cool smile. "No, thank you. Send it to the legal department. They'll need it for the file." The signed confession for repayment was merely the last piece of paperwork from a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, already a ghost within the association machine. What she and everyone else in the room were witnessing was not the battle itself, but the slow-motion replay of a war that had already been won. The bombs I had planted weeks ago were now detonating in sequence, a perfectly timed cascade of procedural and legal checkmates, all triggered by a simple automated schedule. While Vicky was staring at her own shaky signature, a series of emails pre-drafted and scheduled to be sent at precisely 9:15 p.m. were deployed from the HOA server. The first was a mass notification to the entire board as well as key homeowners. Its subject line was brutally efficient: temporary suspension of President Victoria Langford, appointment of interim leadership. It detailed the suspension, cited an ongoing investigation into serious ethical and financial violations, and named her interim replacement, a seasoned homeowner known for her ruthless efficiency in association turnarounds. The bomb had gone public. Simultaneously, a second email landed in Vicky's now-locked HOA inbox with a copy sent to her personal email and to Eleanor Vance. This was the formal notification of her suspension, but it came with an attachment. It was a PDF copy of the Harmony Grove Workplace Relationship and Conflict of Interest Policy. Specifically, it was the final page, the one she had signed during her onboarding process 5 years ago. I had the secretary pull the scanned original from her file. Her signature was clear and bold. Highlighted for her convenience was the section that explicitly forbade romantic or sexual relationships between a president and a direct or indirect subordinate due to the inherent power imbalance and potential for favoritism or coercion. Marcus Hale reported directly to her. Her toast hadn't just been a personal humiliation for me. It had been a public confession of a policy violation, a liability for the entire association. She had handed them the legal justification for her termination on a silver platter. To ensure my own actions were unimpeachable, I had taken a critical step 7 days prior. The next slide I could have shown but chose not to would have been a confirmation receipt from the State HOA Internal Control and Ethics Committee. I had submitted a formal whistleblower report. It was filed anonymously using a secure portal and was assigned a case number WB881C. It detailed without emotion or personal reference the financial anomalies, the kickback scheme with Evergreen, and the potential conflicts of interest. By lodging it officially, I had wrapped my entire investigation in the armor of association procedure. I wasn't an avenging neighbor. I was a protected whistleblower acting in the community's best interest. Any attempt by Vicky to retaliate or frame this as a personal vendetta would now be seen as illegal retaliation, opening her and the association up to even more severe penalties. I had made myself untouchable. The shock waves were not contained to our room. At 9:20 p.m., another scheduled notification, this one from the association legal department, was sent to the CEO of Evergreen Landscaping. It was a formal notice of contract suspension. It informed them that all existing agreements with Harmony Grove were being frozen and all pending payments withheld, pending an immediate and thorough investigation into potential conflicts of interest. Vicky's greed hadn't just cost her the presidency. It had potentially jeopardized a multi-million-dollar contract for her partners in crime and triggered a state-level legal incident. To that end, I said, speaking into the thick silence as Miriam and David read the notifications on their phones, I took the liberty of engaging a third-party forensic accounting firm this morning. Their team will be at the clubhouse at 8 a.m. tomorrow to begin a full independent audit. The oversight board has been copied on the engagement letter. This was the final nail. An internal investigation could potentially be managed. An external audit meant total transparent exposure. There was no hiding, no spinning the narrative. The numbers would be laid bare for all to see. Amidst the association carnage, there was a small human movement. Marcus Hale. His face streaked with tears that had smudged his carefully groomed eyebrows. He had finished signing the tablet. He pushed it back across the table toward me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. In the separation agreement I had drafted, I had included one final clause after he signed. It stated that the association would cover the cost of up to 6 months of confidential psychological counseling and therapy. He must have seen it. He looked at me, his expression a confusing mix of hatred and something that might have been a sliver of gratitude. He had been a willing participant, but he was also a casualty, a pawn in Vicky's game who was about to be obliterated. My fight was not with him. He was a symptom of the disease, not the cause. My goal was not petty revenge. It was a clean, orderly, and complete removal of a cancer from my neighborhood and my life. I gave him a single brief nod of acknowledgement. The file was closed. The cleanup was complete. Vicky, finally grasping the sheer, inescapable totality of her situation, did what all cornered tyrants do. She reached for a lawyer. She pulled out her personal cell phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She scrolled frantically through her contacts and pressed a number. She put the phone to her ear, her eyes darting around the room, a wild, trapped look on her face. She was searching for an ally, a lifeline. She found none. After a few seconds, a frustrated look crossed her face. "It's busy," she muttered, pulling the phone away. "He's not answering." She tried again and again. What she didn't know was that my legal team had, as a professional courtesy, circulated a conflict of interest notice to the top 10 HOA law firms in the state that morning. Given that the case involved a senior president at Harmony Grove, one of the largest associations in the county, and was being handled by my own top-tier firm, most other reputable lawyers wouldn't touch her case with a 10-foot pole. She wasn't just isolated. She was legally radioactive. With all the pieces in place, I performed the final administrative task. On my own tablet, I navigated to the secure server where the investigation file 6F23 was stored. Contained every email, every invoice, every archived message, every audio and video file from this evening, every signed document. I ran the final protocol, a function that digitally sealed the file, creating a perfect, unbroken chain of custody. It was now a tamper-proof package of evidence, admissible in any court of law or association hearing. Click. The case was locked. My work was done. As if sensing the shift in the room, the finality of the moment, Antoine reappeared and quietly, reverently, opened the door to the private dining room. A current of cool, fresh air flowed in from the main clubhouse, a welcome relief from the suffocating, emotionally charged atmosphere we had been breathing for the past hour. The air outside smelled of possibility, of a world that was not contained within these four walls of judgment and consequence. It was the smell of freedom. The open door did little to disperse the thick, toxic atmosphere within the room. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting had stopped. A silence punctuated only by the ragged, shallow breaths of the vanquished. The evidence of the coup was everywhere. The dark stain of spilled wine on the floor, the stark white of the suspension letter on the table, the signed confessions that served as treaties of unconditional surrender. Vicky's board, her so-called loyalists, sat rigidly in their chairs, their eyes fixed on their plates, their cutlery untouched. They were no longer celebrating a leader. They were trying to become invisible in the presence of a new terrifying power. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for my water glass. The heavy crystal was cool and solid in my hand, a stark contrast to the flimsy celebratory champagne flutes. I held it up. The light from the main clubhouse caught in the faceted glass, splintering into a dozen tiny rainbows on the tablecloth. It was a clean, clear, simple thing. Water. It does not intoxicate. It does not deceive. It sustains. I looked around the table, my gaze passing over each stunned face, each pair of averted eyes. I did not need to speak loudly. The silence was my amplifier. A toast, I said, and my voice was the only sound in the universe of that room. I paused, letting them wait. To integrity. It was not a cheer. It was a sentence. The two words landed with the weight of everything that had been said and done that evening. They were an indictment, a final judgment. Marcus Hale, who had been staring blankly at his folded hands, bowed his head completely as if in prayer or shame. A few of the junior board members, the ones young enough to still possess a conscience, flinched and looked down at their laps, unable to meet my eyes. They understood. They were witnesses not to a neighborhood squabble, but to an association execution, and my toast was the final volley. Vicky, however, was past the point of shame. She was in the throes of a primal rage, the desperate fury of a queen who has been stripped naked in front of her court. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her face a mottled ugly red. "You destroyed my presidency," she rasped, the words thick with disbelief and venom. "You destroyed everything." In one single night, I took a small deliberate sip of my water before I answered. I let the cool liquid slide down my throat. A moment of perfect calm in the center of her storm. I set the glass down with a soft definitive click. "You misunderstand," I said, my voice even and devoid of heat. "I destroyed nothing." I looked at her, my expression one of clinical assessment. "You held the match, Victoria. You gathered the kindling, splashed the gasoline, and lit the fire all by yourself. I just pulled back the curtain so everyone could see the flames." A dry, authoritative voice cut through the tension. It was Miriam Coulter. She was standing now along with David Sterling. She looked not at me or Vicky, but at the entire table of stunned residents. "Thank you all for your time," she said, her tone laced with a glacial irony that was far more cutting than any anger could have been. "This has been a most productive, unscheduled meeting. We will be in touch with all of you tomorrow regarding next steps for Harmony Grove." It was a dismissal. The party was over. The hearing was adjourned. As if her words were a command to the very room itself, the ambient lighting began to rise, dispelling the intimate candlelit gloom and replacing it with a brighter, harsher, more clinical reality. The frosted glass wall flickered and went dark, returning to its inert state as a simple pane of glass. The muffled sounds of the main clubhouse, the distant clink of glasses, a burst of laughter from another table, the low hum of conversation, began to seep back in, but they sounded alien, as if coming from another world. The silence inside our room remained, heavy and profound. In this new brighter light, I looked down at my left hand. For 6 years it had borne the weight of a small HOA membership pin, a symbol, a contract, a carefully negotiated settlement. It was a beautiful thing, perfectly polished, flawlessly engraved with the Harmony Grove logo. With my right hand I grasped the pin. The metal was cool against my skin. I twisted it once, a motion I had not made since the day I first received it. Came off with an unfamiliar ease. I held it between my thumb and forefinger for a moment, a cold, glittering piece of history. Then I leaned forward and placed it gently on top of my folded white linen napkin. It did not make a sound. It simply sat there, catching the new bright light, a silent final statement. Our association bylaws, I said, my voice clear and steady, addressing Vicky but speaking for the record, for the witnesses in the room, contain a morals and reputational clause, Section 11, subsection B. As of 21 minutes ago, that clause has been formally activated. From my portfolio, I produced the last document I had for her. It was not an accusation. It was a notification. A simple one-page letter from my attorney's office formally advising her of the immediate initiation of asset separation and recall proceedings as stipulated by the now active clause. I laid it on the table next to the discarded pin. The two items sat side by side, the symbol of the contract and the notice of its termination, as if on cue. One of the servers appeared, holding a large elegant box from the clubhouse patisserie. It was the cake, what was left of it, packaged to go. He placed it on the table. Through the clear window on the top of the box, the dark chocolate inscription was visible. The slice I had cut earlier had gone directly through the middle of the word, compliance. The blade had left a clean, perfect fissure, splitting the word in two. It looked like a crack in a foundation, promise fulfilled, a system that had held and then broken her. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The evening was over. My work here was done. I gathered my portfolio, my purse. I did not look at Marcus or the oversight board members or Vicky's terrified board. I looked only at her, at the woman who was now my former president in name only. For a few more legal and procedural hours, she was slumped in her chair, a hollowed-out ruin of the woman who had stood so proudly to give her toast. She looked smaller, weaker, stripped of her title, her access, her lover, and her iron grip on the neighborhood. There was surprisingly little left. I walked to the end of the table where she sat, stopping just beside her. She flinched as I approached but did not look up. I looked down at the top of her head, at the woman I had once thought was merely annoying, and I delivered the final line of the script I had been writing for 6 months. Happy anniversary, Victoria. My final words hung in the air between us. An anniversary wish that was also an epitaph. She didn't respond. She couldn't. She just stared at the table at the discarded pin and the legal notice. A woman completely hollowed out by the truth. And then a sound pierced the thick, dead silence. A sharp electronic ping came from Vicky's phone, which was still face up on the table amidst the debris of her celebration. The screen lit up, displaying a single brutal notification from the secure HOA executive channel. It was a broadcast message sent to the entire board and homeowners. Update V. Langford suspended. E. Thorne appointed interim. It was the public announcement of her association death. Not a rumor, not a whisper, but a formal system-wide declaration. She was no longer just locked out. She was replaced. The finality of it was absolute. Her name, followed by the word suspended, was a digital tombstone. She made a low guttural sound in the back of her throat, the noise of a woman who had just been run through and was only now realizing the wound was mortal. As if summoned by that digital signal, the open door to the room was filled by two figures. They were not waiters. They were tall, broad-shouldered men in impeccably tailored black suits with discreet earpieces. They were the clubhouse's executive security detail, the men who were usually tasked with escorting visiting dignitaries and ensuring the safety of the board. Their presence was calm, professional, and utterly chilling. They didn't look at Vicky with aggression. They looked at her with the complete disinterest one reserves for a piece of furniture that needs to be moved. Miriam had called them. This was no longer a private dinner. It was a secured association site. She was no longer the host. She was a potential liability to be managed and removed. Antoine the manager reappeared at my side, holding the small POS machine and the leather folder containing my sign bill. He did not even glance at the security guards. His focus was entirely on me. Ms. Thorne, he said in a low voice, just your final confirmation. He showed me the receipt. The charge was for the exact amount we had discussed. The room, the food, the initial arrangements, my part. I took the stylus, and in the profound quiet the scratching of my signature on the electronic screen sounded like chalk on a tombstone. It was the last thing I would ever pay for on her behalf. A clean transaction, a closed book. As I finished, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. It was Marcus. He was pushing his chair back, his movement stiff and awkward. He clutched the white envelope containing his severance agreement to his chest like a shield. He did not look at Vicky. His gaze was fixed on the door on the path to escape. He had made his deal with the devil who had won, and he was not going to waste a second glance on the one who had lost. He was survival in a navy blazer. Miriam Coulter stepped toward me, her face unreadable but for a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of a problem being efficiently handled. She placed a light, almost imperceptible hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was one of solidarity, a signal from one position of power to another. We're done here, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was an order, a statement of fact, and a release. The business was concluded. I gave her a single nod. I had no more words. Everything that needed to be said had been said, signed, and recorded. I turned away from the table, away from the wreckage, away from the woman who was now a stranger in a red satin dress. I walked toward the open door. The two security men parted silently to let me pass, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power. As I stepped out of the private dining room and into the main corridor of the clubhouse, the cool night air drawn in from the terrace slid across my bare shoulders. It felt like stepping out of a pressurized chamber. The release of a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 6 months. The muted sounds of the clubhouse washed over me. The gentle clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversations about things that didn't matter, the distant notes of a piano. It was the sound of a world that was still turning, a world that was utterly indifferent to the life that had just ended in the room behind me. And then I heard it, her voice. Emily. It was a desperate, ragged cry, not a roar of anger, but the broken plea of a woman calling out from the bottom of a well. It was the last arrow in her quiver, the final desperate attempt to reclaim my attention, to pull me back into the drama, to make her ruin about us again. I did not stop. I did not slow my pace. I kept walking down the plush carpet of the hallway, my heels sinking slightly with each steady measured step. Her voice calling my name again was already fading, becoming just another part of the ambient noise of the clubhouse, no more significant than the clatter of a distant plate. It was the sound of a song ending, the final notes swallowed by the silence that follows. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I didn't need to check it, but I wanted to. I wanted to see the final receipt for my long and painful transaction. The screen glowed to life, displaying the last notification I had received. It was from the secure app connected to my attorney's firm. It was a simple, stark confirmation stamped with the official seal of the law offices. Bylaws Clause 11 be activated. Asset separation and recall protocol initiated. It was done. Every I dotted, every T crossed. Perfect, clean, and total victory. I didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for joy, but for a quiet, cold satisfaction. It was the feeling of a complex problem solved. Corrupt system purged. A balance sheet finally reconciled. I reached the end of the corridor and the grand entrance to the clubhouse. The city lights of the surrounding suburbs glittered outside the tall glass doors, a sea of infinite possibilities. I did not look back. I would never look back. The camera of my memory pulled away, the final shot being the closed, unmarked door of the private dining room behind which a woman's world had been systematically and irrevocably dismantled.